Our presenters for the webinar today are Sherry Davidoff and Matt Durin. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and author of Data Breaches. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Her latest book on ransomware response will be published early next year. Matt Durin is the incident response team lead at LMG Security. He is an instructor at the International Black Hat USA conference where he teaches data breaches. He also regularly conducts cybersecurity webinars and seminars for hundreds of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. A seasoned forensics professional, Matt specializes in incident response, ransomware cases, cryptojacking, and banking Trojans. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana and previously worked as a blue team field technician / system administrator for over 10 years. His malware research was featured on NBC Nightly News. Sherry and Matt, at this time, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I just want to note that Matt and I are co-authors, along with Karen Smeyer, LMG's COO, of the Ransomware and Cyber Extortion book. So check that out early next year. But with that, let's talk about planning your cybersecurity budget for 2022. I know that this is the time of year where everyone starts crunching numbers and thinking about what we should be planning for in the year ahead. So today we're going to start off by talking about spending trends in cybersecurity. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes over the past year. Matt is going to introduce you to a case study, Lone Star Law. What happens when you really don't have a cybersecurity budget? And then we're going to talk about how they built their budget going forward and what we need to do as well. We'll talk about how we can reduce our risk, invest in high impact security technologies, maintain an effective IT infrastructure, and that's the whole point of maintaining an effective IT infrastructure. Is it's kind of like health. Even if it doesn't directly relate to security, having an efficient and effective IT infrastructure is part of your foundation. And then we want to employ effective detection and response tactics. And finally, big trend for 2022 is going to be investing in people. I'm calling it right now a 2022 trend. We're going to leave you with your cybersecurity budget checklist at the end of this webinar. So in response to last year's webinar on cybersecurity budgets, you guys said we want numbers, and we listened to that. So along the way, you're going to see in this presentation specific numbers. I want to give a big shout out to Derek, our cybersecurity researcher, who spent many hours researching the cost of different types of products, comparing them, looking at the different licensing models. And because of his work, we are able to bring you those specifics today. So thank you so much, Derek, for everything you've done. All right, so your big question is, how much should we spend on cybersecurity? Well, the answer is, drum roll, it depends. Okay, you saw that coming. It is based on a variety of factors, and we'll talk about that throughout this presentation today. So sorry to get you all excited. We will circle back around to that at the end and give you some rules of thumb. In general, though, a really big trend during 2021 is that cybersecurity spending is up. Gartner has been predicting that cybersecurity spending is expected to grow 12.4% this year, meaning that it will reach $150.4 billion worldwide. The good news for all of us, though, is that you don't necessarily have to spend more in order to have a program that's more effective. This is a quote from the Deloitte & Touche study a year or two ago on financial institutions. And what they found is that how a security program is planned and executed and governed is likely as important as how much money is devoted to cybersecurity. And Matt, I'd love to hear you jump in, but I can tell you I've seen many, many times organizations spending top dollar on cybersecurity equipment, but unless you actually plan for the resources to manage it, you're not really going to get the most return on your investment. So Matt, would you agree with that how the security program is executed is just as important and maybe more important than how much money is invested in it?
I would argue it's more important than how much money is invested in it. I mean, if you're paying millions of dollars for a cybersecurity program and you're not adequately staffing or training for how to utilize it, it's basically like buying a high-end sports car and never learning how to drive. I mean, there's the nice flashy thing that you have, but unless you can actually use it, it's not going to do you much good.
Yeah, really great analogy there. So again, how do you get the most bang for your buck? If you look at this chart, this is a chart that shows what are the root causes of ransomware attacks. You can see there's really only three major factors here. Email phishing, we've all heard about that before, software vulnerabilities, and RDP compromise, remote desktop protocol compromise. Three things. And these are the things that repeat over and over again. There are high impact security technologies that actually aren't even that expensive, which can obliterate these risks, really dramatically reduce them. So number one, we want to invest in those specific high impact security technologies. It does not need to be the end all be all appliance. Sometimes it needs to be just as simple as multi-factor authentication. Number two, you want to reduce your inherent risk, and we'll talk about this more, but simply by reducing your data, deleting your data, you can reduce your risk. Number three, maintaining that effective IT infrastructure. We're going to talk about a few key things that you want to make sure you have in place. Detection and response is critical because the sooner you detect an attacker in your network, the more likely you are to prevent data theft and ransomware from being deployed. And then finally, as we've already alluded to several times, invest in people. Training and staffing are absolutely critical. And as an industry, we have underinvested in people in the past 2 decades. And now we are ready to invest, and it's become critical. Along the way, remember, do not get distracted by the new shiny thing. It's really tempted to be like, ooh, a special box that will catch the attackers. Let's spend $1 million on that. But really what we need to be investing in is people and time to configure our systems properly, to be trained up on how to use them. Leverage your existing capability. We'll talk about several instances today where you probably already have access to advanced security technologies that are not activated on the network or that you may not be taking full advantage of. So kind of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, you may have the power with you all along. And we'll discuss that today. And finally, start with the low-hanging fruit. Again, there's no point in trying to catch the advanced persistent threat if attackers can just walk in the front door with a weak password. So that low-hanging fruit is absolutely key. Oh, Batman. All right, so Matt, why don't you introduce us to our case study today, Lone Star Law, a Texas law firm that suffered an unfortunate security incident.
They did, and they really provided a good baseline for how we put together this presentation. So this is a case that we took care of back in June. So we've had the summer to kind of marinate on the lessons learned from this one, and really utilize this as a roadmap for how to go from almost no cybersecurity program whatsoever up to honestly a pretty well-functioning one in just a couple of months and without putting that much money into it. So the law firm is about 150 people overall. They're a corporate law firm, so they handle Fortune 50 companies, wide range of different kind of engagements, including things like medical cases, employee disputes, patent lawsuits, a very, very wide variety of data. They had one full-time IT person to manage this entire network. And from a security standpoint, we'll talk about it here as we get into staffing. That's frankly not enough manpower to actually run a network of this size. And they've never really invested too much into cybersecurity as a whole. Now, I want to point out these are not bad people. This is not someone who is intentionally neglecting their cybersecurity program. It's just the unfortunate fact that a lot of times cybersecurity spending does kind of fall by the wayside as something that's not viewed as a priority in an overall organization's budget. I'm hoping after we go through some of the items in this presentation that you'll agree there are better ways to go about this. Okay, so what happened? Well, hackers attacked the organization. They were able to break in and steal data. The client was notified by this because a couple of their top partners received a very scary sounding email. Initially, this was one of those emails that I'm sure we've all seen before, basically something along the lines of, I hacked your webcam and saw what you did, pay me, or something like that. But in this case, they told them they had stolen all of the data from their network, and they claimed to have exfiltrated about 2 terabytes of that data. Maybe they're lying, maybe they're not. Then it turned out, well, they had some evidence to back that up. They provided some screenshots of files, some screenshots of directories, and were threatening to publish these on the dark web if a ransom wasn't paid within 24 hours. And originally they demanded about $650,000.
And Matt, this is a trend, right? This is one of my favorite articles that you're showing on the screen. I feel like law firms in particular have gotten hit, but many organizations are suffering from this new trend of exposure extortion, where the criminals are threatening not just to lock up their data, but also to publish it.
Yeah, honestly, in recent cases that we've worked, not even recent, over about the last 18 months, this has become kind of the go-to for cyber criminals. So protecting your data, making sure that you don't fall victim to one of these attacks is critical to defending your network overall.
And now they weren't held for ransom in this case, right? Or sorry, they weren't hit with ransomware. This was more a straight up cyber extortion threat to publish.
Yeah, that's correct. In a strange twist, there was no encryption software deployed on this network. They didn't lock up any of the files. They didn't do anything malicious on the network that would restrict access. They simply walked in the door, stole the files, and then let people know they had stolen them.
So unplanned cybersecurity incidents are pretty much the worst thing for your budget. They completely bust your budget. Here's the average cost of a data breach from the new IBM report on cost of a data breach, just came out. But you can see, even for smaller organizations, less than 500 people, the average cost of a breach is almost $3 million. Yup, thank goodness for cyber insurance coverage if you have it. Larger organizations, that cost can balloon to over $5 million on average. And if you're hit with a ransomware attack, then the cost to remediate that, not even the ransom itself, the cost to remediate is about $1.85 million on average. And again, we're starting to see ransom amounts routinely in hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. So cybersecurity incidents have become extremely expensive, and the best thing we can do for our budget is to try to reduce the risk of them occurring. So how did the hackers get in, Matt?
Yeah, this was a really interesting turn of unfortunate events that we saw for the client in this case. So, like many other organizations, when COVID-19 hit and the pandemic forced everyone into work from home, they had to kind of scramble to develop a strategy for continuing to work. The idea they came up with and deployed inside their network was to utilize LogMeIn installed on all of the local computers that the attorneys and other employees in the office would normally be using, but to allow them to go to their home and access the network using pretty much whatever they had available. So this was a widely used bring your own device setup that they very, very hastily implemented. When we think about this, it basically means that they effectively doubled the size of their technology environment overnight. However, these new devices that were going to be accessing the network were not company managed. They did not have controlled or centralized antivirus, and they were not utilizing multi-factor authentication for any of these logon interfaces. So this was kind of a disaster waiting to happen at this point. So how did the attackers actually get into the network? Well, after analysis, we concluded that a home computer was unprotected and unmonitored. A hacker broke in, likely using a phishing email or a compromised utility or something like that. They were then able to use that LogMeIn access that was already pre-configured and saved on that employee's home computer to effectively stroll right through the front door of the organization and have access to all of the data that was available. They then went through and stole that data, and that was about the end of the compromise at that point.
And unfortunately, this is a really common problem. So many people have rushed to BYOD, and it's really just a different risk model. Matt, I know you had shared the survey from Black Hat last year. Is that right?
Yeah, so yeah, it was ironic to see this this kind of coming out into the public sphere, something that was actually happening, because at the end of Black Hat last year, there was a survey done on the IT professionals that were there, and two of the biggest risks that they noted as being the things that kept them up at night, the things that gave them heartburn about the upcoming year, were things like vulnerabilities in systems being used for remote access by quarantined home workers, and the possibility that home workers would break policy and expose enterprise systems to risk, and that's pretty much exactly what we saw in this case.
So one of the top things you can do to reduce your risk is reduce your attack surface. Again, as Matt pointed out, in this case, we have employees working off their home systems. They are remotely logging into their desktops at work, and they've been doing that for well over a year now. So now we have two systems that are being used regularly by each employee, and then that desktop internal to the organization is used to access the file sharing repository. Do we need that number of devices? No, of course not. And in this case, it's going to be much cleaner and better, and probably better for performance, not just for security, to be issuing those employees a company-owned laptop and allowing them to log in remotely directly to something like a VPN server. So you can totally cut out that desktop entirely. If you reduce your devices, you're going to reduce your maintenance costs. You will reduce your software licensing costs in most cases. And again, just by reducing the number of computers that could get hacked, you are going to reduce that attack surface. Now, how much does it cost to get an extra laptop? I mean, when you add them up, a lot of people are like, we can't afford to buy equipment for everybody. But attorneys do not need like high-end gaming systems like Matt here does. Often a simple laptop less than $1,000 will do the trick, and again, will dramatically reduce your risk of having a cybersecurity incident and enable a more streamlined maintenance process. Now, again, as we talked about, BYOD is a huge risk. Sometimes it's helpful for your organization and employees might like it, but your personal devices have just a different risk profile. You might have employees engaging in higher risk web surfing. They might share the computer with their teenagers or their family that don't have work-related restrictions like acceptable use policies. Maybe there's no antivirus. You don't know if they're investing in security software. There's definitely no continuous monitoring in people's houses. So if their computer gets infected and an attacker steals their password and uses it to log into your systems, you might have no idea until it's too late. So what can you do about this? Well, you can deploy security software on personal devices, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Or you can, and actually in addition, you can use a mobile device management solution, an MDM. So Matt, why don't you tell us about rolling out MDMs?
Yeah, so MDM software is a great way to maintain the devices that are remotely accessing your network. And we threw a couple of examples up here on the screen, but these are by no means the only two that are available out there. But it does give you an idea of kind of what the pricing model looks like. So if we're looking at something like Jamf, which is really geared towards monitoring and controlling iOS devices, so Macs and iPhones and things of that nature, Jamf is a very easy program to roll out, and it only runs about $3 a month per iOS device or $7 a month per Mac. That's a cost that can be really easily justified in terms of the security that you get back from having that managed policy. Microsoft Intune is the Windows or Microsoft version of that and can handle Android phones, iOS phones, and a lot of other devices. But again, $6 per user per month, depending on which level of subscription you have, is not a major amount of investment in order to greatly increase the security of your overall network.
That's right. There you go, guys. Numbers, anywhere between $3 and $7 a month is the cost of rolling out that MDM per user. Okay, second thing we need to do is routinely apply security patches. Matt, I know when you were analyzing the logs, pretty much all of the remote workers were still on Windows 7, correct?
Yeah, and not just Windows 7, but Windows 7 home versions. And Windows 7 was end of life in January of 2020. So allowing that kind of a system to access your environment that does not even have security patches available for it anymore exposes you to a lot of risk just right off the bat. There's not a lot you can do to stop that. So there are some tips we can get into here in just a little bit to keep those from getting onto your network in the first place.
Yeah, this is just part of that basic IT hygiene. Make sure you're keeping your software up to date so you can get patches, and then make sure that you have those patches applied. If you are actually going to patch all of your application software and all of your operating software, you have to be tracking what applications are on everybody's computers, making sure that you have time to regularly track vendor updates and patches and get those applied. So that's where we need to invest in tracking of resources and also in staff to help apply these patches. We can also invest in secure remote access. Do you want to walk us through this, Matt?
Yeah, so VPN is one of the most secure solutions that you can add into a network in terms of providing a remote access point for employees. And a VPN appliance can do a couple of really nice things for you. One, it can set some minimum standards for endpoints being able to connect into your environment. As we talked about with our Lone Star case, there were a number of devices connecting into the network that were either old unsupported operating systems, did not have appropriate antivirus software installed, were in an insecure configuration state. Those are things that a VPN can scan for ahead of time and block people from being able to access until they meet those at least bare minimum criteria. The other one that we really want to suggest people take a look at is virtual desktop infrastructure, or a VDI like Citrix or something like that. This means that we don't have any exposed remote desktop interfaces out there. We can log into these systems through a VDI server. We can spin up a brand new secured kind of sandboxed environment for the user to perform their daily activities. And if something goes wrong, we can just revert it back to its original state. We don't have to worry about introducing malware into the network at that point.
I think it's worth pointing out that RDP compromise, again, is one of the top reasons that organizations are hit with ransomware. So if you are able to directly log into your poor computer that's sitting out there on the internet using RDP, you're probably at a very high risk. And in fact, I know that cyber insurance companies are actually scanning public interfaces of prospective insureds, even without necessarily telling the prospective insured about it, in order to understand that level of risk. That shows you how important this is. Simply by turning off direct access to those servers, turning off RDP, you can dramatically reduce your risk and make a big difference in your security profile.
One of the other things you might want to think about is where your employees are logging in from. If they're logging in from a home network with a nice router and decent security software on their own end, then they're probably in pretty good shape. But if you have employees who regularly access your network from the road, from airports, from restaurants, from hotels, from places like that, then the introduction of a VPN service for your employees to utilize can be a big boost to your security as well. It allows you to encrypt the traffic that's moving back and forth between your employee and your network. And again, VPN services are not that expensive, especially when we're talking about just a straight per user cost. We might not have to have an entire organization set up on one of these services. We could look at our users that are on the road frequently or are at a higher risk, have it just for them. But we're looking at anywhere between $8 and about $16 per month for a secure VPN access system that these employees can use to mask their traffic and make sure they're not being caught by public Wi-Fi sniffers or any of the insecure networks that we run across frequently, like a coffee shop or somewhere like that.
If you want to compare that with a VPN appliance like Fortinet's products, for example, the Forti client that you use for the VPN will cost you about $3,000 for up to 2,000 users. So just to make that distinction and give you guys some more numbers, since I know that's helpful for people's budgeting.
Perfect. And yeah, we mentioned virtual desktop infrastructure, and this is kind of what it looks like to spin up a VDI for your organization. I actually really like these. I've worked with a bunch of different organizations who utilize VDIs as their primary means of remote access for their employees, and it's a great solution for them, especially if you have a lot of employees who are either temporary employees or who don't need a dedicated workstation. We're looking at $7 per user per month to get a standard workspace running for someone that they can log into from pretty much anywhere. That's going to be a great cost saving, especially if that person doesn't need that hardware or that that dedicated workspace to actually function in their job role. Very, very good solution to that problem.
Yeah, sometimes the more secure solutions are also the more effective ones. Okay, then what happened, Matt?
All right, so one of the big questions that we had when we started into the investigation, and one of the questions the client understandably had as well, was how did credentials for something like LogMeIn get compromised? And when we go into one of these investigations, we like to cast a wide net. We noted that they were using Office 365, the E1 version, and that'll become relevant here in just a minute. But they were utilizing cloud-based email. So out of due diligence, we went into their cloud-based email. We pulled back all the log data that we could. And we discovered a couple things that were a little troubling. We found that there were multiple accounts that had been potentially compromised. And if an employee gets access to your cloud email system, they can do a lot of things that are very detrimental to your security, like downloading emails, setting up forwarding rules to forward communications out of your network. Basically, we had to assume at this point, without knowing any more at this exact moment, that everything in their email and SharePoint was potentially hacked. And business email compromise is huge. This is one of the most costly types of cyber attacks that an organization can undergo. More expensive than ransomware, and most people don't think about it that way. So again, this is a big deal in securing your cloud services.
So what can you do to protect against this? Deploy multi-factor authentication. Again, when we authenticate someone, we are verifying their identity. We can do that in 3 ways: with something you know, like a password, something you have, like your driver's license, or like an app on your phone, and then something you are, like your fingerprint or an iris scan, things like that. So something you know, something you have, something you are. Today, we know that researchers have found 15 billion stolen usernames and passwords on the dark web. And so we have to assume that your password is stolen. We can no longer afford to rely on single factor authentication, particularly when it involves passwords. So always use multi-factor authentication, especially on those cloud interfaces. I really can't stress that enough. We often see it deployed in emergencies, just as in the case of Lone Star, and it is going to be smoother and less expensive if you do it in advance. There are some cheap and even free options. Google Authenticator, Microsoft's Authenticator are free to use. There's also options such as the YubiKey. This is the Swiss Army knife of authentication. You can, and you can see right here, you can plug them into your computer as the second factor. You can use the fingerprint reader. You can use near field communication, all kinds of stuff. Matt is going to go into this in more detail next month when he does the webinar on authentication. So I'll just hit the highlights here. You also want to make sure to turn off weak two-factor authentication. So often text messages can be intercepted. There was just a study a couple months ago, a journalist actually did an expose and found that a hacker was able to obtain all of the text messages sent to his phone by paying an SMS enablement service $16 and just asking for them to be redirected. So make sure that you recognize that text messages are not secure. Any multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication, but ideally you want to be using something like an application or a hardware token instead, and turn off that weak 2FA that's used as a backup. So for example, in Office 365, you can click sign in another way. And if you're getting a text message, that may be something that an attacker can intercept, even if your users are regularly using the app. So keep that in mind. Even better is to use centrally managed authentication using something like Duo or Okta. And this will allow you to set up single sign-on. It'll make it much easier for your team members. You can choose different forms of multi-factor authentication, whether it's a physical token or Touch ID or facial recognition. This is great for hybrid environments where you may have some BYOD, some people using their own personal devices, because you can support different types of authentication. You can do role-based access restrictions. You can even do access restrictions depending on the type of device that is coming into the organization. So if it's a personally owned device, maybe you don't allow, maybe you have some extra checks in place. So check it out, Okta, Duo, they range in price from anywhere between $3 to $6, even $9 a month if you get the extra features, all the bells and whistles. So check that out. It is one of the most important things to invest in right now. And if your passwords are getting stolen, of course, there is a risk of further cloud compromise, both for the organization and for the employee. So at Lone Star, we know that hackers infected a staff member's computer, an attorney's computer. We know that passwords were stolen. And there's a risk that people are reusing that same password for other things. So it could affect your corporate online banking or file sharing applications. The employee themselves may be at risk, and that can affect you if, for example, hackers are able to log into their payroll account online, look at their employee benefits, redirect payroll to a different account. Then both of you are out the money and you have a problem to follow up on. So as Microsoft says, hackers don't break in, they log in. Very insightful quote from a Microsoft executive. All right, so how can you prevent password reuse? Another important priority for this year is investing in password managers. If you do not already have a password manager deployed to your employees, run, don't walk to your computer and get signed up for that. Password managers are designed to remember many different passwords. They make it so that it is possible for you to pick a different password for every application without going crazy. The human brain, of course, is not designed to remember 200 different passwords. And you can also generate, you can use it to generate unique passwords so that you're not following a pattern. So you want to roll out a password manager to your staff so they have a secure way of generating and storing unique passwords. These are, again, relatively inexpensive. LastPass ranges from $4 to $6 per user per month. Dashlane, $3 to $6.49 per month. Remember, if you do put all your eggs in the password manager basket, you want to secure that basket. So make sure that once your passwords are in the cloud, you're using multi-factor authentication to secure your password management system. I highly recommend deploying a password manager along with multi-factor authentication to protect your login interfaces. All right, Matt, so do you want to tell us what you did next? How did you lock out the hackers? I know you guys were concerned that they were still in the system. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a major concern when we initially started the investigation and the remediation of the event. We wanted to make sure that the hackers didn't still have access to the network or still have access to the cloud services that were being utilized. One, because obviously we want them out as quickly as possible, and two, we don't want them to be able to see what we're doing. So we went on a very rapid schedule to deploy multi-factor authentication to the company, and we were able to get multi-factor applied to their LogMeIn interfaces, but it turned out we could not deploy MFA on their Office 365 system, and there was a reason for that was a major roadblock for us. They were still using Microsoft Office 2010 as their primary desktop-based email and document clients. The reason they did this was because they were using some older document management applications that integrated directly with those pieces of software. Now, with Microsoft Office 2010, That hit its end of life in October of 2020. So it's been out of service for quite a bit and is no longer receiving security patches. It's also not supported by modern authentication methods like more of the newer Microsoft pieces of software are. Essentially, this means we can't put multi-factor authentication on their email client because they will have no way to actually use Outlook in that scenario. So it really does bring around the importance of keeping software up to date and maintaining those up to date operating systems on your network. So we pulled the Windows 10 pricing for $199. You get a license for Windows 10. This will eliminate the Windows 7 Home problem that people were running into. And just natively, this is a much more secure operating system. Obviously, it's not unbreakable. Hackers break into Windows 10. They also break into Windows 7, but they break into Windows 7 a lot more frequently and with a lot more ease. So for that small investment for each one of our users, again, we've put up a nice wall there to at least make breaking into the network a little bit more difficult. Now, in terms of the pricing for applications on the network, when we're talking about the use of Office 365, there are some perks to moving up in your license level with that. Again, our client in this case was using Office 365 E1, so basic Microsoft Exchange. That meant that they didn't have access to new applications. They didn't have access to a lot of the security and logging features. If they bump themselves up to a slightly higher level, either E3 or business standard or something like that, that means that the users who are utilizing the system can access new versions of those pieces of software directly from Microsoft. So they have up-to-date Microsoft Office suite. They have up-to-date Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, everything else they need to integrate with their software and to do their daily work, but they don't need to rely on a vastly outdated piece of software to do it. And again, this is normally a monthly subscription fee at this point. So it makes it really easy from a budgeting standpoint to allocate that much money for a year for each one of the users. It makes planning a lot more simple than not knowing exactly how much a new software suite is going to cost every time. All right, so we got into their email system. We pulled logs from there. We compared that with their LogMe and logs. We looked at activity on the network, and we came to the conclusion that they had been hacked lots of times. And we don't actually know that each one of these hacks was directly related to the data theft from their network because they had happened fairly frequently. One specific attorney within the company had logins in their Office 365 tenant from 39 unique country codes, and this activity had been going back as far as we had log data for. Now, again, their Office 365 E1, and that means we have 30 days worth of logs on that tenant. We have nothing past that 30-day marker. And so if the log activity goes all the way back to 30 days, we don't really know how far back it went beyond that. So we could just kind of have to assume it's all compromised, or at least that's what the lawyers tell us we normally have to assume. So knowing that, we had to work with the client to begin the process of notifying their clients that they had suffered a compromise of their confidential data. Not a situation you want to find yourself in. But again, it shows the importance of updating that subscription in Office 365. If you are updated to either E3 or E5, or if you have any of the advanced auditing features, that gets you access to a lot deeper information in terms of what's actually happening on the network. And if you've worked in Office 365, you've likely seen this. This is the standard auditing and compliance center. You can use this just right off the bat to run searches for when a user has logged in and out, when documents were accessed through SharePoint. On certain subscription levels, you can see when specific mail items were read inside of an inbox. So having access to that kind of data can be very, very helpful in determining when a compromise might have started, how far back it might have gone, or how far it went into the organization.
And you might also want to take a look at something like Splunk, a central logging server. In fact, it's a really good idea to do central logging because if a hacker breaks into your servers or workstations, one of the first things they do is delete the logs. If you're actually sending those logs in real time off of those systems onto a separate server, then you are more likely to have access to them in the event of a cybersecurity incident. And you could also be reviewing them proactively in order to identify threats that are lurking within your network. So here's a chart for Splunk. I first deployed Splunk at a hospital that I was working at. Gosh, I think it was 2005. It was a great product then, and I've only continued to be impressed at the additional features that they've added. So take a look. They actually price based on the gigabytes of logs that are ingested. So it's not actually per endpoint or per user. It's just solely based on the amount of log data that you're sending. And the higher the volume of logs, the lower the cost is per gigabyte. So then we have to think about who is actually watching our logs, who is monitoring our network. It's quite a liability if you have alerts in your logs showing that there's unauthorized activity, but nobody's actually watching them or taking action. And in fact, that was happening in the case of Lone Star, right, Matt? I know that there were indications, what was it, like 2 in the morning, it was clear that there were people coming in, attackers from all over the world, and nobody was seeing that. Is that correct?
Well, they didn't have any kind of centralized logging and monitoring enabled. So if someone was looking at the logs, they would have been able to see it, but they were not staffed appropriately for that and did not have any of those logs being retained.
Yeah, it doesn't really work when you have to log into every single different system to see that, but they did have that information in their logs, but they also didn't have staff to review it. So what you want to do is engage a 24/7 monitoring service. It's just not realistic to think that your 3 IT guys or even your 23 IT guys are going to be able to monitor 24/7. They go on vacation, they have families. It's a very good idea to contract specifically with a service where all they do day in and day out is monitor your network. They have shifts and teams of people that they are constantly training so they know what to look for. You also want to make sure you have an emergency response plan if you receive an alert that it will be acted upon. So really important to budget for that. How much does it cost? Here are 4 different options. We have Arctic Wolf, one of my favorite monitoring providers. For 300 different assets, meaning 300 different systems, it costs about $21,000 annually. Compare that might sound like a big number, but compare that to the cost of a breach, and it is very, very small. Crowdstrike is another example. Matt, I know you work with Crowdstrike on a regular basis. Can you tell us a little bit about the pricing model there? Because I know it's different.
Yeah, Crowdstrike operates like a lot of other cybersecurity services in a per asset per month kind of a pricing structure. So you can expand or contract the service that you have with them kind of as you need it or as you see fit in your environment. On average, for in comparison to Arctic Wolf, if we're looking at about 300 assets, we're looking at between $30,000 and $50,000 annually. And again, that may sound like a big number right off the bat, but compare that with the cost to implement this infrastructure on your own and then hire staff that's able to 24-hour monitor. You're looking at a significant cost savings there. It leads to some other things, though. I mean, we don't want to just hand over keys to the network to a monitoring service or an MSSP without knowing a little bit about them first and how they operate. They're not all created equal, and they don't all monitor for the exact same types of behavior. There are some specialized services out there. So we want to make sure we're asking the right questions when we're looking at who we want to basically be the overseer for the security of our network. We want to know what's in their toolbox. You know, what kind of software applications do you actually use? How do you monitor these networks? We want to know if their employees are certified. Are they trained up on using these very specific pieces of software? Because when we're looking at monitoring software or EDR software, these can be pretty complex software suites. They're not the easiest things in the world to use. We also want to know how often they update their software. Are they going to be using out-of-date remote management toolkits that can be compromised and used to compromise the network on our end? We want to know what security controls they use. I mean, how secure is their network? How clean is your house before you come clean mine? And do you offer a guaranteed response time? I mean, if we get hit with an attack at 2 o'clock in the morning, are we going to know about it at 2 o'clock in the morning, or is it going to be 8 a.m. when we come in the next morning that someone will finally email us about it? So again, we want to make sure we're just doing our due diligence on these providers.
I think this is especially important in that post-SolarWinds world where really anybody can potentially get hacked. You really do want to make sure that if they're going to have administrative level monitoring and control over your network, that you're vetting them and you understand how they're going to respond if there is a problem. So at this point, there's a train rushing up to hit us at Lone Star, right? It turns out they've been collecting all data from cases that they've handled and from engagements that they've been working on since the beginning of time. They've never purged any information. They've never archived any information. So they have a huge repository of data. In fact, the hackers, if you recall, said that they stole 2.7 terabytes of data. I don't know if we emphasize this enough, Matt. Over 2 terabytes of data, which is very unusual. It is expensive for hackers to steal and store that amount of data, and we don't often see that. So also think about where the data is. If they are going to have to consider notifying because of a potential breach, they need to do a legal review of the information that could have been hacked. And unfortunately for them, they have data on employees' home computers. They have data in the cloud. They have data on local workstations. They have data on servers. Much of this, if not all of it, has been hacked, and they have to sort it out and figure out exactly what information they have. And in this case, there's probably no way for them to do a full inventory. Now, where this is going is that they will probably have to notify all clients of a major data breach. Clients may come back to them with questions like, what information was hacked? And they need to have an answer for that. So they will have to inventory stolen data in an emergency, which is hugely expensive. They also did an emergency deployment of multi-factor authentication. A lot of times we see a partial deployment, or there just isn't the political capital to do a multi-factor authentication deployment, but in an incident, boom, it happens because you have to. Remember, in this case, we believe the attackers have stolen some passwords, and so the attorneys, we had to lock out their home computers in order to prevent the hackers from being able to come back in as well. And you really need to turn on that multi-factor authentication to make sure that that they can re-steal a password and then log in. So if you're going to be put in a situation of doing an emergency deployment of MFA, consider backing that up and doing it ahead of time. And then an emergency deployment of security software. We're going to get to that in a moment. In all likelihood, they're going to see lawsuits. They're definitely going to see reputational damage and some major financial damage as a result of this. So let's jump in and talk a little bit more about the emergency inventory, because this is literally a part of the response process for just about every cybersecurity incident I've ever seen. The first question is always what happened, and then the second question is what information might have been compromised. And it turns out that's a process, figuring that out. Okay, what information could be on the system? We're going to look at that archive. We're going to see exactly what type of data it is. And then you may need to drill down and get a listing of all the companies or all the individuals that are affected. When you're doing this in an emergency and you're paying lawyers and you're doing it after hours and on the weekends, you are basically burning money. This is extremely expensive. And often you can't do it as well as you could if you were doing this ahead of time, not in a rush. Because think about the home computers. What if an employee doesn't let you inventory their home computer, even though they store sensitive stuff? What if an employee has left and brought a repository of data along with them? So these are some challenges that we face. In order to address this, we need to routinely conduct data discovery and mapping. And this is something we talked about during our May presentation on how to optimize your cybersecurity program. So check it out if you haven't already. It's available online. But the bottom line is when we conduct an inventory, we can start off by doing interviews, manual examination, and then improving that over time. But to do it even more effectively and efficiently, you want to start using automated tools. The good news is that many of the software suites you already use have some built-in capability to do this, and Office 365 is a perfect example where there are built-in features to do data classification, data discovery. Some of you may already have a license that enables you to do this, you just haven't turned it on. Others may need to upgrade in order to take advantage of those features. And then consider using dedicated data discovery and data mapping software. OneTrust is a great example of this. I have several clients that use it and really like it. And you can see how it allows you to visually map the data. Data mapping starts at $500 a month, and then data discovery starts at $2,500 a month. So do that analysis and figure out, again, what is the cost-benefit ratio to this that you want to see. We also need to inventory assets like physical devices in order to make sure that we're properly protecting them. If you don't know where your data is or where it's residing, then you can't possibly protect it properly in a cybersecurity program. So Matt, I know you've used plenty of asset management tools because you're secretly on the blue team. Do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, so asset management tools can be really, really helpful from an IT discovery standpoint. If you want to know what exactly is being used to access your network or where those data repositories might be, if you want to know what operating systems are operating within your environment, then utilization of something like Manage Engine or Asset Panda or something like that is hugely helpful. You don't actually have to go from desk to desk and ask people. You can automate that process, and there are open source tools out there that will provide you this information as well. They're a little steeper learning curve to get into how exactly to use them, but again, open source is always an option here.
Yeah, and I know some of the ones on the bottom row are free and open source, such as Asset Tiger. I believe up to 250 assets is free. IT Asset Tool 3 up to 35 assets. RefTab is free up to 50 assets. So keep that in mind. Good potential resources for smaller organizations. Okay, you also want to think about including a data loss prevention tool. This is software that specifically monitors your environment It can automatically protect sensitive data from leaving. So it can monitor network traffic, email, so that when people try to email documents to their personal email accounts, it can block that. And it can also alert you to prohibited data flows. Typically, that cost is between $4 and $7 per computer per month. So again, there's that monthly license model. So Matt, do you want to talk us through the Semantic data loss prevention system specifically?
Yeah, Semantic was one that we thought was a good example because they really illustrate what we're looking at accomplishing with DLP software. So there's a couple things that make this unique in terms of just a general security software suite on your network. One, you can set up specific kind of descriptions of data that you want to know about on your network. So if you specialize in payment cards, you can set up DLP software to explicitly look for payment card data, so you're not accidentally leaking things like credit card numbers. You can do the same with insurance policy numbers, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, all of that. And really what we want to do is be able to view data in kind of all three phases on the network. We want to be able to review it in storage. We want to be able to review it at rest on an employee's computer. And we also want to be able to view it in transit. And this is one of those that can kind of take all three of those. Pricing starts at about $4.86 a month. So thank you, Derek, for going down to the penny on that one. We really do appreciate that. But it gives you an idea of kind of how much it costs to add that extra layer of security to your arsenal.
Thanks, Matt. The bottom line is this all comes down to sensitive data on your network. The more data you have, the more your security program will cost. And the quickest and cheapest way to reduce your budgetary needs is to reduce your data. Data is hazardous material. You have to control it carefully if you store it, and that's expensive. So reduce your risk by reducing your data. This is something that you're not going to necessarily want to spend a lot of money on software, so much as investing in people and time to track all this data down and then audit what you have, reduce it as much as possible, and then check and make sure that that's being done on a regular basis. So store less, delete more, one of the cheapest and quickest way to quickly reduce your risk. All right, back at Lone Star Law, attorneys are actually still locked out of the network. I know, Matt, you were trying for a deployment of multi-factor authentication, and that partially worked. But there is a concern that the hackers may still be lurking in the network, and it was time to clean them out. So talk us through how you did this.
Yeah, so this is where we jump into one of the services that we feel is one of the most important things you can be doing on your network just on a periodic basis throughout the year, and that is proactive threat hunting. We took this opportunity to drop some next-gen EDR software or endpoint detection and response software into the network that would give us an actual view into not just the computers that were inside the network, but the home computers that were then being used to access through that log me in interface. We wanted to know exactly what was happening on each one of those systems, and without deploying the software, we would have had really no way to do that. So there's a couple important things we can do when we do threat hunting like this. We can identify weak points in security. We can identify weak configurations, high-risk user behavior. There's a lot that can be gleaned from this, and it should be done periodically. I mean, we're looking at doing this on like a quarterly basis or a monthly basis even, spending a little bit of time looking for those types of threats that antivirus isn't going to catch. So when we're talking about EDR software, we're talking about very specialized software like something like the Carbon Black interface. It's more than an antivirus software, although it does offer those same kind of benefits, but it allows us to see behaviors on the system, to see at a kernel level what's actually happening inside the OS. And it runs as a pretty inexpensive expensive software suite for what you actually get out of it. So for the Carbon Black EDR toolkit, we're looking at roughly $50 a year, give or take, depending on the partner that you buy it through and how long your contract is with them. That's very similar to other high-end antivirus softwares out there, and you get a little bit deeper look into what's actually happening on the network.
One of the reasons this is so important, as you can see on the screen here, is that attackers are leveraging normal IT administrative tools in their hacks. So here you can see the attackers using PowerShell, which is a tool that IT administrators might use. So antivirus software is not going to alert on normal IT software, but criminals are using it. And so we need to really step up our game and look at strange behaviors and not just strange software.
Exactly. And this is what we were talking about a little bit earlier too when we were talking about the monitoring systems. This is the Crowdstrike EDR toolkit, which is another really advanced endpoint detection and response toolkit. We really like this one a lot. This one goes for the Falcon Pro system, $8.99 per endpoint per month. So again, we're looking at a different kind of pricing model than a yearly license, but when we look at the overall benefit, again, that $8.99 per month or even the $15.99 a month becomes very worth it when we consider how much we can stop from happening on a network in the first place, and we don't end up with a a major data breach on our hands because we caught something early. That's the big thing that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and if you have any further questions about things like endpoint detection and response software, feel free to drop Matt and I a line on LinkedIn or email us at info@lmgsecurity.com. We deploy these for our clients all the time, and it's way better to deploy it before a cybersecurity hack as opposed to afterwards.
Yeah, significant benefits there. All right, so using our newfound access into the system, we were able to basically come to some conclusions that were very impactful for how we move forward. So we were able to trace the attack back to one specific user inside the system. This was an attorney who had been working remotely. His computer had become infected, and we were looking at that through the LogMeIn logs primarily, and we were seeing evidence of this on his inside the office computer. Now, this meant that we needed to get the EDR software onto his home computer. We needed to secure that endpoint and make sure there was no additional problems we were going to run into because of it. We got some pushback from the individual user about this, and I mean, that's not too uncommon. This is their own personal computer. This is not something the company owns or maintains or pays for. This is their own hardware, and they were honestly a little leery about having us put this very full-featured monitoring software on their home computer, just so they were probably just concerned with their own privacy at that point, and that's understandable. But because of that, we were not allowed to let them back into the network until they agreed to do this, and we've talked about that in a couple of our other cases. What we found gave us a little bit of cause for concern. We were able to identify there was a viral load on the home computer. It looked like there was a remote access toolkit on there. We also found that they had been storing large volumes of corporate files locally on the hard drive, which was one of the kind of doomsday scenarios we were talking about previously. If this individual user sold that computer or moved to a different organization, all of that private data would likely go with them. And again, we were able to determine that this all started, surprise, from a phishing email. And that brings us up to the costs of phishing emails and how expensive they are for organizations moving forward. The stats you're seeing on the screen here are for large organizations on average per year across the last couple of years. They're looking at about $14.8 million lost per individual organization annually because of phishing and the associated costs that go along with it. That includes things like the loss of productivity from having your email system shut down or employees being unable to access those, the cost of credential compromise if it's not contained. So it becomes very expensive very quickly.
Yeah, I think I want to point out here, number one, the costs have quadrupled over the past several years, but also you didn't originally see the costs of business email compromise and ransomware being tracked, and now you do. So we're starting to see those more sophisticated attacks where phishing is we're able to draw that line between phishing and the direct financial losses that happen as a result of them. So I'm sure that we'll continue to see this trend over the next few years. What can you do about this? Well, the good news is we can actually protect against the risks of phishing emails. The human firewall is one of the most important components of your security infrastructure. It is absolutely critical to invest in general awareness training. Simply doing a 1-hour webinar once a year with your team is not going to cut it. Cybersecurity needs to be top of mind. As you can see, 38% of companies today are doing security training at least monthly, and another 23% are doing it twice a month, which is great. It's important to be budgeting for training at least monthly. One of the ways I see that done effectively is through on-demand awareness videos. And again, this allows people the opportunity to take these videos on demand wherever they are. It means that security is top of mind and that you're constantly refreshing and making sure they're aware of the latest threats. Who should you train? Obviously your employees, but also train your leadership, train your board of directors, customers, because you may inherit risk from customers or for other community members. Here's an example of pricing for a popular awareness training system. This is KnowBe4. I would recommend going at least to the gold level, if not higher. And you can see it ranges, if you do a small number, it's $21 a seat, all the way up to the highest level is only $10 per user per year. So pretty affordable considering what you're getting, that on-demand regular training. And it also includes customizable phishing training so you can send them test phishing emails. So again, I love this. We deploy it to our own clients as well. So feel free to drop us a line if you want to look into that as an option for your organization. And then finally, make sure that you're tackling the low-hanging fruit. As Matt can tell you, when we look at cybersecurity incidents, you can usually trace it back to something that was entirely preventable. Matt, why don't you run through these 3 things real quick that they can do?
Yeah, 3 of the things that if your employees don't need to be able to access these features will stop a lot of phishing attacks. That's things like blocking Microsoft Office document macros. That's one of the primary ways that malware gets onto a computer. Restrict user access to install apps in Office 365 so we can avoid consent phishing. And then block the use of encoded PowerShell. That's really, really common when attackers are moving through a network, especially if they're using something like Crowdstrike to use encoded PowerShell to actually run their commands. So just by taking those 3 steps, you greatly reduce the availability for those types of attacks.
Great. So we're going to talk about the conclusion of Lone Star Law. I know we're running up to the hour, just so you're aware, we will be going a little bit past the hour today. This webinar is being recorded, so you can tune in afterwards if you have to jump off to another meeting. And otherwise, stick with us. We'll do Q&A at the end as well. So the good news in this case, because there is good news, is that Lone Star did actually have access to their data the entire time, meaning it wasn't locked up with encryption software and they were being held for ransom in that way. Now, we are seeing more and more double extortion as a trend, where the criminals are locking up the data and holding your organization hostage, causing these big operational outages like the one you see on the screen here, where employees could not turn on their computers. They were literally completely down. And then at the same time, they're also threatening to publish the data. So we have to be prepared for that eventuality. And the way we do that is by making sure we have really good backups. So you want to make sure you're archiving, encrypting, storing your data off-site. The attackers know that backups are key and that you will be in a much worse position if they're able to destroy your backups. So we find that they are regularly seeking out your backup systems, trying to write over your backups or delete them, and then often they'll encrypt the backup server as well. So make sure you've got those offline backups, or at least backups that are non-writable, immutable. You're taking incremental snapshots so you can revert to a fairly recent time frame. You understand the retention times and that you have a plan for restoring. We've also seen plenty of cases where an organization is down, they do have good backups, but it would take a week to get them fully restored or more, and the organization just can't afford that level of downtime. So make sure you test your backups, or you don't have backups. That's what Karen Springer, our COO, likes to say. And then make sure you understand how long it takes to restore backups and any other little ins and outs that might affect your ability to recover. So here's an example of a data backup system. Matt, can you walk us through some of these features?
Yeah, of course. So this is the Veeam backup system. We're very used to seeing this in organizations as their primary means of backup. Works really well for both virtual and physical devices on the network. Starts at about $5,000 for a full license. That gets you a year subscription for the entire service. And it's one of the fastest backup systems that we've worked with. I mean, we can go from a completely dead computer up to an operational operating system in a very short amount of time. So it makes it a very good choice for recovering quickly from a network.
Yeah, thanks for sharing information on that one, Matt. So tell us what happened with Lone Star.
Okay, so with Lone Star, we were able to track down that patient zero machine. We knew how the attackers got in, which gave us a pretty good idea of how they were able to get the data inside the network. We still needed to deploy MFA, and we were working through the breach investigation and fallout. Really, what we wanted to do was make sure the hackers couldn't get back in, and we also had to start working at this point with the client to start implementing on a more permanent basis these changes that we were making. So things like the EDR software that we had put in place, the multi-factor authentication they were using. This is really where the rubber hit the road in terms of deploying that new cybersecurity policy for them, and it started moving along pretty quickly.
So then they needed to rebuild, and really, I'm not even going to say rebuild because they didn't have a strong cybersecurity program to begin with. They needed to build their cybersecurity program back up. And the big question was, how much should we spend on cybersecurity? A question I have heard before today. So the answer to that is not just it depends, but how much risk are you willing to accept? And who are you? Are you the head of IT? Are you the CEO? Are you the board of directors? So think about who in your organization needs to be comfortable with the level of risk and should have input on how much is budgeted. You need to invest time, effort into developing a cybersecurity plan and budget. You can't do this overnight. To give give you some rules of thumb though, here's some numbers from a study by Deloitte and Touche. This was a study of financial institutions. And what they found is that in 2020, about 10.9% of the overall IT spending went to cybersecurity. So that's the statistics as a percentage of overall IT spend. If you look at it per full-time employee, it was on average about $2,700 per full-time employee went towards cybersecurity, or 0.48% of overall revenue, so about half a percentage point. Now, keep in mind, we are anticipating, based on Gartner's report, that those numbers will go up about 12.5% this year. And that's because we're seeing a greater investment in things like data inventory, people, training, staff, all the things that you need to really ensure that your cybersecurity program is effective. Where you need to start, though, is leadership. Let's sit back for a moment and think about, do you feel like you have a trained and experienced cybersecurity professional within your organization? Some of us do, some of us do not. One of the critical mistakes we see, though, is assigning the head of IT the job also of cybersecurity. So, and that is exactly what happened in Lone Star. We definitely see more breaches and more cybersecurity incidents in cases where a strong security professional is not at the helm. Every organization needs a qualified chief information security officer. That doesn't mean you have to have a full-time one in-house. In fact, often we consult part-time with our clients as effectively fractional CISOs. And I know many other experienced cybersecurity consultants do the same thing. So if you don't have budget for a full-time security person in-house, that is very common. You don't have to, but you certainly can outsource, and it's really important to have someone to turn to who can help you prioritize, who really understands both the compliance frameworks that affect you, as well as your IT landscape. So you need somebody with cybersecurity experience, not just certificates, familiarity with the controls frameworks, and that strong IT background in a leadership position. And for those of you that are interested in getting into cybersecurity, or who are already in cybersecurity and just looking to beef up your skills, I would definitely recommend that two-pronged approach to training, both technical and compliance, because that can really help provide a well-rounded foundation. So speaking of which, another area where we're seeing a ramp up in budgets is investing in staff. Matt, I know you've brought up this chart a few times. Do you want to share your perspective on this?
Yeah, of course. So this is a Kaspersky survey that came out last year, and it was addressing the high rate of turnover that we see inside of the tech industry in terms of IT security operations professionals. One of the big things that we were noting that Kaspersky was noting as a high factor of this was a very high workload. About 73% of IT security teams are understaffed, according to this survey, and I would say from real life, experience, that's right about on the nose. And we need to keep in mind too that IT and security staff are not necessarily interchangeable positions. IT staff might not be security staff. Security staff might not be IT staff. So by staffing appropriately and by training appropriately, we can allocate the workload between those two out to their appropriate components, and not end up just tossing all of our responsibilities onto a very small team of people who then inevitably burn out and cause a high rate of turnover, which by itself is a major security risk.
Absolutely. And it's a really good idea to invest in regular ongoing training, because your IT staff are working with technologies that are constantly changing, AWS or Office 365 or other different software products. And that means that we need to expect that they're going to need time and budget for ongoing training. In fact, if you invest in training, especially security training that is specific to the software products you use, you will find that pays dividends, because then you're going to be able to more fully leverage those features. You will have trained staff in-house that can help with this. And often these trainings and certificates are fairly inexpensive. So check them out based on the technologies that you leverage. When you're looking at your overall budget, other factors to consider include things like, what are your regulatory requirements? How much sensitive data do you have? If you track your data and you reduce it, then you will only need a lower budget. Think about if my infrastructure was down, what would the business impact of that be if it was down because of a security problem? Look at the current threat landscape and determine how it affects you. And also, what are your consumer and stakeholder expectations? Are you a financial institution? Do they have an expectation, a high expectation of privacy? We often see that less with other industries like manufacturing organizations that have less sensitive information. And then finally, once you've laid out your plan and you've got a proposed budget, you know what your priorities are, one big question that comes up is, how do I get management to approve my budget? And again, that answer is empower your executives. Your whole executive team and your board of directors need visibility into the risks and also into the trade-offs. So make sure you're monitoring your security profile and the risks. You're providing regular reports to upper management and to the board of directors, and give them a choice. Here's the increase in risk if we don't spend money on this, and here are the potential consequences. And then your board can make an informed decision, which is increasingly important because there's a trend of both board and executive liability that we're seeing. So Gartner is warning that CEOs are likely to be personally held liable for breaches by 2024. In the breach of Yahoo, Yahoo's shareholders filed a derivative lawsuit personally against the officers and board of directors, which was settled. So it's very important for everyone, all the way up to the board of directors and including the executive team. Everyone should have visibility and input on that process and accept the risk that comes out of it. If you want more information on monitoring your risk, check out our May webinar, How to Optimize Your Cybersecurity Program, where we go into detail on that. Okay, in order for your board and your executive team to make smart, informed choices, they need to be educated and aware. Cybersecurity evolves very quickly. We need ongoing professional training for that. So make sure that your board of directors and your executive team get regular snippets on cybersecurity trends and threats, that they have at least an annual update and a review of the budget. You may want to consider having a board committee that specializes in cybersecurity issues if you don't already. And finally, again, make sure your executives and your board of directors have the metrics. They have an executive report that they can refer to. So with that, here's how you get the most bang for your buck. Focus on reducing your inherent risk by mapping and deleting information where you can. Investing in high security technologies that really make a big difference, like secure remote access, multi-factor authentication, password managers, and mobile device management solutions. Maintain an effective technology infrastructure. So up-to-date software backups, software patches, 3 critical things. Deploy effective detection and response. So engage a 24/7 monitoring service. Make sure that you level up and pay for an appropriate logging level in both your applications and your cloud applications, as well as your on-site ones. Conduct proactive threat hunting, so you're identifying threats sooner, before data is stolen and before ransomware is deployed. And last but not least, invest in people. I think that's going to be the #1 trend of 2022. I'm calling it right now. Make sure you're investing in general awareness training, security leadership, so have budget to hire. Most of the time, security is understaffed. So make sure you're engaging a qualified security leader, you're educating your IT staff on security related issues, and you have a formal process for educating your board of directors and your executive team on cybersecurity issues. With that, I'm Sherry Davidoff, this is Matt Durin, and you can contact us using LinkedIn or by emailing info@lmgsecurity.com.